Welcome to Oh the Humanities, a podcast produced by the University of New England Center for Global Humanities. Our conversations are devoted to shining a light on the important work being done in the humanities at UNE and other colleges across the U.S. and around the world. My name is Josh Pahigian, and I'm your host. Our guest today is Colin Woodard, one of the foremost experts on North American regionalism, the sociology of United States nationhood, and how our colonial past shapes and explains our fragmented present. Colin is the author of the award-winning book, American Nations, a history of the 11 rival regional cultures of North America, and several other books, some of which we'll talk about in our chat. In addition to his luminous career as a historian, Colin has also enjoyed tremendous success as a journalist. As state and national affairs writer at the Portland Press-Herald, he received a 2012 George Polk Award and was named Maine Journalist of the Year in 2014 and was a finalist for the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Explanatory Reporting. A longtime foreign correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, Colin has reported from more than 50 countries and 7 continents. He currently serves as director of Nationhood Lab at the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy at Salve Regina University. On September 23, 2024, he will present a lecture titled Uniting a Divided America at the Center for Global Humanities on UNE's Portland campus for the Health Sciences. Colin, welcome to Oh the Humanities.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Have you been enjoying this glorious Maine summer?
Yeah, in between the bouts of rain, it's been pretty good. No drought this year.
That's right. We can't complain. Well, let's get down to business. First, I wanted to just say how excited I am to host you at the center next month. We're all really looking forward to it, and I'm really grateful for you taking the time to sit down with us remotely today to chat about your life's work. We'll try not to steal the thunder from your upcoming talk, but we'll talk a little bit more holistically about your work, and we'll talk about some of your books. And eventually we'll work our way around to talking about your work at Salve Regina. So first, I'm curious to learn, how did you arrive at North American regionalism as your research focus and your area of expertise? When did you know that that was the area you really wanted to do a deep dive on, and that was where you would make your mark? Was it a conscious decision, or did you find your way to that topic organically throughout the course of the early part of your career?
It evolved. I started actually as an undergrad as a Balkans East European studies person, because I graduated from high school in 1987. So it was all perestroika and glasnost, and Mikhail Gorbachev was maybe going to change the world, and the Manichaean struggle between East and West, with nuclear armed powers about to bring the end of the world, that maybe there might be some incremental and exciting change that might happen. So I gravitated towards that as an undergrad, and spent my junior year abroad, my junior semester abroad in the fall of 1989 in Budapest, Hungary. And when I arrived, it was communism. And while I was there, it all collapsed. And I was fortunate to see many of the big events firsthand at the time, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to, the last months of the Ceausescu regime and so on. And I was hooked. So I went back there the following summer on an undergraduate research grant to Romania to try to understand how the regime had really fallen. And then after I graduated, went and lived there essentially for most of the 1990s and most of my 20s. And this was a laboratory for understanding that history matters, that the lines on the map and where the lines should be in people's minds or were in different imperial times have an enormous effect, that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what it means to be a member of the Hungarian nation or the Romanian nation matter a great deal, that big lies can be used to motivate people to do terrible things, right? This is a period when not only were autocracies and dictatorships collapsing, but others were starting to form, including sort of genocidal regimes. I covered the aftermath of the Bosnian War while I was there, which was a terrible tragedy right on Europe's doorsteps that occurred through sort of big lie thinking. So all of the big themes of what I study now were things I was immersed in at the time there. And then, towards the end of the 90s, I moved back to the US and started traveling as a global affairs correspondent all over the world and started writing books. And the American Nations was really my third book. There was one about, it came before that, about Maine and the cultural history of Maine that got me interested in our backstory, about the deep history. Why are Mainers the way we are? Why is there this thing when I was growing up where there's people who are natives, not indigenous, but are natives because their people have been there for 10 generations and everyone else is from away? Where does that come from? Why this animosity towards things from Massachusetts? So I plunged into that, wrote a book called The Lobster Coast that required I do a big dive into colonial era history to understand the answers. And that began the process. My next book was on the Caribbean pirates, which was like doing a massive primary research dissertation kind of on who the Blackbeard and that pirate gang really were. But in the process, I was building my understanding of North American deep history and starting to realize that the fissures you see on this continent are very similar to those you would see in the Balkans. Only people don't understand the history. And so American Nations, the book I'll in part be talking about at the lecture at UNE, is a book understanding that, applying the lessons of the way things work with humans everywhere and applying them to our own continent to explain things like, when you drive through Maryland or Texas or California or Ohio, there's a point when you cross a line and you know that you're in a different country, even though you haven't left the state than you were before. And everyone knows it, but why is that? And the answer has to do with deep differences in the way the continent was colonized and by whom, with all kinds of prevailing values. So that's how I came to it. I came to it via the Balkans. And then unfortunately, the knowledge I learned in the Balkans has become more and more relevant to American life today. So I applied my old world skill set to new world problems.
That's really fascinating to hear how you took that journey deep into those cultures in Europe, and then were able to look inward or homeward, I guess as it was, and understand the United States more fully. So I often tell my students when I'm giving them research projects to do here at UNE, that when we do research, we're trying to create some new knowledge, but we're never really starting from ground zero, right? We're always building on the shoulders, as it were, of those scholars who have come before us. And I know you're the foremost expert on North American regionalism today. Who are some of the scholars that came before you, or some historians that came before you, that laid a foundation for the work you do? And how has your work superseded what they were able to do in that domain?
Yeah, when I was a kid, like maybe 11 or 12, this book by a journalist came out called 9 Nations of North America by Joel Garreau, who's a Washington Post correspondent. He'd basically gone around the continent in 1978 and said, oh my gosh, these places are so different, and divided the country into these separate regions, which he said had attributes of nationhood. And that always stuck with me. It was not a work of history. Methodologically, it was totally different. Its errors are because it didn't understand the backstory. It just tried to look at everything in a snapshot in 1978 and identify the cultures. But that was always with me in the back of my head, I think, to inspire. And then especially David Hackett Fisher's Albion's Seed on the 4 British folkways in North America. So that's he's a historian, academic historian. It's a work which attempts to establish that 4 of the regional cultures, or nations, as I call them in North America, the equivalents of my Yankeedom, Midlands, Tidewater, and Greater Appalachia, all track back to different regional cultures back in the British Isles. And while most of the incoming he got from other scholars were about how he identified the regional cultures and how they were fuzzy back in Britain, his analysis was spot on this side of the continent. And he was mostly looking backwards in that, but he looked through, folkways, child-rearing ways, gender ways, religious ideas. I mean, it's an in-depth sociological, almost anthropological study by a historian that established these things. And in one sort of throwaway chapter at the end, he implies some of the consequences that left, the long tail for events afterwards. That's the part I was interested in. I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. When I came back from the Balkans, I was like, right on that. And so I started looking at those things. And there are more cultures, right? Even Hackett Fisher, in his most recent book, finally added in New Netherland and Deep South and some of the cultures for some reason that he didn't tackle in that book. But it is true that the establishment of these separate regional cultures with their own folkways created a balkanized map of very different regions of the country with different ideological properties. So those two were the most important. There's a bunch of other stuff once I started writing the book that, I drew on in different regional cultures. There's all kinds of foundational blocks and pieces. American Nations is very much a work of synthesis. So almost everything in there is synthesized, if you throw the footnotes from, often journal articles and other work that other people did. And I have used that paradigm since to tackle today's problems quantitatively, actually doing analysis, breaking down by counties and census regions and correlations and doing all kinds of whiz-bang stuff now that we have the model. But the model itself is definitely a synthetic work.
Yeah, absolutely. And synthesis really is the word of the day there. When we're in the humanities departments here at UNE, we're always trying to get students to take A and take C and turn it into Y or whatever it is.
I'm a walking, talking poster child for not only study abroad programs, but for liberal arts and interdisciplinary functions. Because this work incorporates, history, political science, economics, sociology, anthropology, and bits of all kinds of other stuff to get a, correct picture of the world done with a bit of a cultural geographer's paradigm.
Yeah, more than you could ever gain just from looking at the world through the lens of one discipline. Absolutely. You mentioned the Lobster Coast a little bit earlier, and I know it recently, I believe, turned 20 years old, right?
It's been in print I think technically the pub date is early September, so the birthday is coming up.
Okay. Have yourself a nice Maine lobster as a celebratory dinner.
There's a bonus chapter in the new printings taking things up to the present. So we celebrated it with the 20th anniversary edition, as it were.
Wonderful. I also want to ask you about one of your even earlier books, I think, Ocean's End. At UNE, as I think we're very proud of our marine science program and of our environmental programs. I think our marine science program's top 10 nationally by most of the rating agencies, and we have our own island off the coast in the Atlantic. So our students are really interested in the environment, in climate change, in the warming Gulf of Maine and the effects of that. So I think they would be interested to hear you talk a little bit about that earlier work of yours.
Yeah.
So please tell us what the approach was there and what you learned from it.
Absolutely. That was my first book, written in my late 20s when I was still a foreign correspondent traveling all over the world. The Year of the Oceans was coming up, and I did some Year of the Oceans series with the different publications I worked for while writing the book. So it's called Ocean's End Travels Through Endangered Seas. It came out in 2000. And at that time, the idea that the oceans themselves could be destabilizing and that large marine ecosystems could be under threat was still kind of novel and not in the public consciousness. And the idea that, is climate change real or not was the kind of question still floating around in the scientific community. Yeah, we think it is, but are we seeing any changes yet? I don't know. Maybe there is in Antarctica, but look, in the Arctic region, there isn't. So that was the times. And I did this travel. The chapter takes place in each of a different place in the world. And I went to these places in this course of a single year. I spent 6 weeks with the National Science Foundation in Antarctica. I spent 4 weeks out in Micronesia in the Central Pacific with all the low-lying states that will disappear because of sea level rise. I learned to scuba dive early on the Belize Barrier Reef and did that. I was in the Black Sea, circumnavigating the Black Sea in the Balkans, which had undergone a catastrophic ecological collapse, but I circumnavigated it, hitching a ride with a seaboard symposium on a gigantic ship, like a conference held on a ship, hosted by the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, the senior figure in the Orthodox Christian Church, who was drawing religious leaders and environmental leaders and politicians from all over the world to discuss how religion and science could work to save the environment. So you had like David Bellamy and, David Suzuki and the EU Commissioner of the Environment and the Crown Princes of Serbia and Denmark and, the three cardinals and all of these, Orthodox figures. So circumnavigating the Black Sea, looking at its environmental problems. I was in Louisiana for the sinking of Cajun country and the dysfunctional relationship with the Mississippi River and eutrophication from all the fertilizer coming in. So it's this big globe-trotting book, travelogue, journalism, and science merged together is what it looked at. And my interest in that has continued. I thought, the Cold War's over, the country, the world can now move on to the big problems, which are going to be environmental, the problems in the oceans, the emerging problems with climate change, and that would be what I'd focus on. So I spent sort of a 7-8 year period as a globe-trotting, like global affairs correspondent, looking at environmental and science issues all over the place, in Greenland and Iceland and the Netherlands and, all sorts of places. And of course, instead, we didn't solve those problems, and sort of authoritarianism, balkanization, nationalism, my original skill set have risen up. So I ended up transferring, but I've still followed those things. I was a longtime trustee of the Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences. And the Pulitzer Prize nomination you mentioned was for a series I did for the Press Herald on warming in the Gulf of Maine that came out in 2016. So paying attention to those issues. Lobster Coast, of course, had a lot of marine science conservation elements to it in that book as well.
I think you really speak to the role of non-scientists in sounding the alarm and educating the public on climate change. I think that's such an important part of it. It's not an issue that has been tackled or can be tackled by scientists alone, but certainly people from other disciplines. And I applaud you for doing your part to tell that story.
Thank you. And part of the idea of that book that made it different than a lot of environment books at the time had been, is because I took a journalist and historian's point of view, I was looking at the intersection of people with the collapsing environment. Like one of the chapters was in Newfoundland, where the entire fisheries had collapsed, the cod fisheries. This was before they discovered oil offshore, which transformed the economy, but it was bleak, the relationship between people and place, the Marshallese and the rising seas, all that kind of stuff, the New Orleans and the threat that if a hurricane ever struck New Orleans, that the dikes would fail, right? The book came out a few years before it happened, but people kind of knew and nobody was doing anything about it. So that intersection, it's not just the science, it's the people's interaction with it. And if you want people to care about it, how that affects cultures and communities and everything else becomes an important part of your whole picture.
So taking it back to your primary topic here, I guess. So I read Union this summer, your excellent book, Union, and I'm finishing up American Nations now. So I know I'm reading your books out of order, but I hope to explore those earlier ones before too long. But I had a question. American Nations has definitely helped me understand our internal divisions better, but I've also noticed the rise of authoritarianism, as you mentioned just a minute ago, around the globe, whether it's Marine Le Pen's movement in France or Maduro's rise in Venezuela or Orban in Hungary. I think we had protests this summer in Britain protesting refugees. So as that's happened, we have these global forces tending toward authoritarianism. We also have our history and our pockets of the country that are in their own sort of ideological space based on the long tail of who settled in those regions and how those cultures evolved. At some point, do we get to the point where we can't separate the global from those local aspects that you focus on, or are they always sort of in a interrelationship where there's give and take between them? Or do the local relationships still prevail and still kind of steer us no matter what's happening globally? I was just curious how you see those two, I don't know if they're competing, maybe I should say interrelated forces, global and local.
Yeah, well, I think they're the reason that you're seeing a rise in authoritarianism and a backsliding in many of our peer liberal democracies at the same time is they were all experienced the same stresses to the system at the same time. It's much like, World War II happens and it affects everybody on both sides of the Atlantic and Pacific. But in each place, it's going to play out a little bit differently, the same stresses. And the stresses were, when I was living in Eastern Europe and the Balkans after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was this belief that history was over. nationalism was over, liberal democracy and free market capitalism had triumphed. Everything's going to be great. It's a unipolar world. The United States is the uncontested superpower. It's going to be Pax Americana. Everything's going to be great. And hey, it's not really that democracy defeated autocracy. It's that free markets defeated communism. And therefore, free markets are going to be great. Borders will disappear. Look, the EU is eliminating all their borders and creating borderless travel. Pretty soon, states won't matter. People who are, worried about nationhood and nationality are just the leftover Neanderthals who haven't gone extinct yet. Stay tuned. That was what everyone was saying. And I was living in Hungary, and I could tell you could see that none of that was going to be true, that if these countries, if Hungary and Slovakia and Czech Republic and Romania joined the EU, that there was going to be some major headwinds because notions of belonging and who could belong and where the borders should be and all that were not cosmopolitan in that sense by any stretch of the imagination, but also that things, people care about things other than their economic self-interest more than their economic self-interest. Like, who am I? What do I belong to? Am I a blank? What does it mean to be a Hungarian if suddenly there's all these foreigners living here? Oh my gosh, some of the foreigners speak Hungarian. What happens to my identity? I'm a British person living in some town in the Midlands, and there's all these Polish people living here now because there's free travel in the EU. And when they drink tea, they don't drink it the same way, and they don't behave the same way we do at the pub. But this is the only place where you can behave in this Midlands English way, and our way of life is going extinct. And you're destroying my sense of identity and belonging and those things are very powerful forces that no one was paying attention to in the 90s. So globalization, with its economic consequences in the EU, they were consolidating a lot of power and decision-making in administrative bureaucracies that weren't necessarily have democratic legitimacy. And people were moving around in a way that not all the people in each of these countries actually had realized what would be happening and that it would change life. It caused a lot of currents at a time when everyone was just poo-pooing it, the dislocation of jobs from place to place, NAFTA here in the United States. Right? Don't worry, if you're in the Rust Belt, sorry, you're in the loser industry, you need to retrain or move. Right? There was this attitude that, all these globalization changes where things were getting bigger and more centralized and more efficient, but there were tons of losers geospatially and between countries and class. That was all just ignored, right? And then there was the challenges, right? You had 9/11, which for Americans challenged our security environment, and then for the whole world triggered the forever wars. And then you had the 2008 financial collapse, right? Where suddenly all the people you're supposed to believe in who know what's going on running the economy don't, and we just bailed them out. I mean, those hits to the system and the fact that, we did the forever wars and there were, no weapons of mass destruction there, the discrediting and the damage that did, globally in a lot of senses, to the sense of a unipolar world, to a sense that the people in charge know what they're doing, the anger that nothing was changing. That's what set the stage for the rise of authoritarianism in all these countries at once. And it plays out differently, right? In Hungary, authoritarianism is doing just fine. Whereas, in France, Marine Le Pen just, it's a powerful force, but just got reprimanded and lost that election, and see the reversal against the Tories in Britain. I mean, the repudiation of the Tories for behavior that is much less out of norm and egregious than Trump and Trumpism. I mean, they're thrown out of office by staggering margins, whereas here, that same kind of authoritarian forces times 10 are much more competitive. So what I'm saying is the local matters a great deal in how people react to a similar set of stresses and threats.
That really helps to explain the context in the different countries that differentiates it. Very, very helpful. So one more book I want to talk to you about, The Republic of Pirates. And you mentioned it earlier, and I know it was made into an NBC series with John Malkovich. I think it was called Crossbones. I know you were a historical consultant on that, and you have been for other documentaries, History Channel, Netflix, Smithsonian Channel, those sorts of forums. And I was just wondering, I'm interested personally, just learning, like, what does a historical consultant do? Are you working with the script writers? Are you on set when they're actually filming? Are you giving pointers to the talent, the actors? Like paint a picture of what a couple or one of those roles was like for you, and if it was rewarding, if it was frustrating. I'm just curious what that experience was like.
My role in these were different. A lot of the shows I was talking head, on air, expert. So I played that role. They interview me, sometimes going to an interesting place, to Paris or, London or something to record some of these things. So those are fun, but I'm basically an expert on camera. NBC Crossbones is legally based on Republic of Pirates. I was not consulted at all in the end because of the change in showrunners. I can't tell you what I think of the show because they have a non-disparagement agreement. And then Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed 4, Black Flags, the video game. I was a historical consultant on that, and it was precisely as you describe. I worked closely with the script writer, and my job was kind of like if I were on Mad Men, it would be like I'd be the guy who said, no, in April 1964, the secretary would not have that handbag. She'd have this handbag, right? I was discovering and making as accurate as possible the settings because the conceit of the Assassin's Creed franchise is that the locations they're creating are as historically accurate as possible. So they wanted to recreate within the bounds of the game a pirate era Nassau and Caribbean that was as accurate as possible. And every detail I could find that was out of place, my job was to try to fix it up. And that was great fun. I mean, the product they created, even though it's a video game, was so much more accurate and true to the actual history than Crossbones or many other things you see. I was very impressed with it. And the writer I worked with, Daria McDevitt, was like, if I remember right, he was like a Joyce scholar and writer himself. So I mean, they had real actors who I see on my BritBox, like British actors playing a lot of the roles or wearing the suits so they can do the live action. They can put the skin of Blackbeard over the person, but it's actually acted by an actor. They had real talent doing that. And was able to meet a lot of those people in a sort of global release party in Genoa, Italy, that my wife and I went to. So we got to hang out with all the cool Ubisoft people. So that was the most fun of all of them, I think, was doing the video game one.
I would have never expected that. And while my own gaming career sort of peaked at Pac-Man and Pitfall Harry, I definitely know some students who are avid gamers. So I'm going to pick their brains when we get back into classes in a couple of weeks here at UNE. Last big topic to discuss here. I want to talk just about how you've managed the multi-track career that you've put together. You've succeeded as a journalist, as an author. You've dabbled on screen and behind the screen, as you were just describing, and now you're an academic at Salve Regina, where you're directing a lab. So I was just curious, how has that transition gone for you? I think you've been at Salve Regina since 2021, about 3 years ago, if I have that right.
Yeah, I was a fellow the first year setting up my project, but still at the Press Herald as a staff writer. And I've been sort of full-time with them for, 1 3/4 years now.
And what does the lab do exactly? If you could paint a picture for listeners, what's your mission, and what are some of the initiatives you pursue to achieve that mission?
Yeah, I run Nationhood Lab, which is this project I founded at the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy. That's the research center or think tank embedded at Salve Regina. And the project is essentially, it's taking the implications of American nations, American character and union, and applying them and, to solve some of the big problems of today. Writ large, the project seeks to identify and solve the problems of United States nationhood. That means understanding that the Balkanized map created by these separate regional cultures, understanding what that means for phenomenon today. So we have a data journalism portal that churns out, maybe an article every 3 weeks or so, data-driven, maps and stuff of like how this regional geography plays out with gun violence, or abortion opinion, or life expectancy, or the last, election that you just saw, or diabetes rates, disabilities, all kinds of things. and tracking them through time. It gives you valuable information to understand what's actually going on and how, if you wish to intervene or change the status quo, some of the things you might want to consider while trying to do it. So there's that. There's the American character component that we'll get to sometime down the road when we're not at the precipice of autocracy. And then there's the union element. That book was about, so if the United States was really founded in the colonial period by separate countries that didn't expect to be in a country together, and they ended up together at the end of the Revolutionary War by accident, and they ended up in something called the United States together, and they had to create ex post facto an answer for what is the United States? What's it mean to be United Statesian? Nobody knew. They thought they were in a NATO or maybe an EU, or it wasn't a nation state. So we had to come up decades after the fact with a story for who we're supposed to be. And that story was contested from the beginning, essentially between ethno-national vision, where the homeland of the superior Anglo-Saxon race, or a civic vision, where a people's dedicated to the ideals in the Declaration. So Union tells the story of that. Nationhood Lab is finding the answer to the problem, which is we are developing and are just finishing testing a renewed civic national narrative for the country. What's the national story that can inspire people for good, for the good side of the force, for the best version of the United States? And how do you talk about it in a way that people in 21st century America can respond to and understand? And we're doing that through not only, we did all the homework and in-depth work on the Declaration and narratives and all that kind of stuff, but then we went out and have done a whole series of quantitative and qualitative polls, in-depth interviews. We're finishing up the last ones in the field to have a perfected, optimized, and tested, messaging package for a civic national vision of the United States tied to the propositions in the Declaration that people can understand and be moved by. Because if you don't have that, the demagogues and authoritarians will take that space very effectively and bring you to a bad spot, which has already happened here.
You're doing really important work. I think academia is lucky to have you. I'm so glad you found a home at Salve Regina, and we definitely need more unity, more shared sense of purpose, and less divisiveness. And if your work can help get us to that point, I just think it's so important. Colin, we're going to host you in a few weeks here at UNE. We don't want to spoil anything, and I know we've talked about some of the themes that will definitely inform your lecture, but if you had to give a quick elevator pitch to listeners who are thinking about turning out in person or tuning in on our YouTube channel to watch your lecture, how would you tease what we have in store on September 23rd?
Yeah, I'm going to describe how the U.S. got into its current crisis in democracy and how we get out of it. And that will essentially be, you will see the implications of American nations in today's phenomenon in different maps and data. And we'll talk about the backstory of that national narrative I touched on there. And I will, by then, actually have the final results to show on what the civic narrative for good looks like that can help hold us together, and describe why it is that having something like this isn't just some esoteric idea, but is central to, avoiding the fate that had affected many of the Balkan and East European countries that I was living in my youth.
That sounds great, Colin. Thank you so much for joining us today on Oh, the Humanities, and I'll look forward to hosting you in just a few weeks at UNE.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
That's it for this episode of Oh, the Humanities. As always, thanks for listening, and feel free to tell us what you thought of this conversation on the CGH social media channels: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X.